The migration of European religious traditions to the soil of North America frequently exposed the structural vulnerabilities inherent in transatlantic ecclesiastical governance, creating severe friction. The development of the Dutch Reformed Church within the American Middle Colonies serves as a compelling case study in institutional tension, cultural adaptation, and administrative realignment. Established during the 17th century as a spiritual extension of the Dutch Republic, the colonial church found itself bound to a distant mother country. This structural dependency, while providing initial stability and historical continuity, ultimately generated severe operational friction as the colonial population expanded and diversified across the landscape. The American congregations were legally subordinated to the classis of Amsterdam, a European judicatory sitting thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, creating major barriers. This arrangement meant that local consistories possessed no inherent power to examine, license, or ordain their own clergy without direct and lengthy European intervention. For more than a century, this administrative bottleneck stifled the growth of the colonial church, producing prolonged pastoral vacancies and leaving vast geographical areas without adequate leadership. The logistical impossibility of managing a burgeoning frontier church through a distant maritime bureaucracy transformed a matter of simple order into a critical crisis of survival. This foundational tension reached a critical flashpoint during the mid-18th century, accelerated by the pietistic fervor of the historical movement known as the First Great Awakening. The arrival of experiential revivalist preaching challenged the formal scholastic traditions favored by the European hierarchy, exposing deep-seated ideological fractures within the colonial leadership. It forced congregations to decide whether they would remain a cultural enclave of the Netherlands or transform into an authentic American institution capable of autonomous maturation. The structural architecture of the Dutch Reformed Church in the American colonies was characterized by a fundamental disconnect between geographical reality and administrative authority. The institutional footprint began in 1628 with the organization of the first formal congregation in New Amsterdam, assembling 50 communicants of mixed Walloon and Dutch lineage. As agrarian and commercial migration expanded outward, additional congregations emerged along the fertile corridors of the Hudson River, Long Island, and northern New Jersey. The underlying mechanism of governance did not evolve alongside this territorial expansion. The logistical parameters of this relationship bred systemic inefficiency, severely limiting the ability of local leaders to manage their own growing churches without massive overseas administrative delays. Because the colonial assemblies lacked the legal right to ordain ministers, every single request had to be transmitted across the Atlantic. Local pulpits remained vacant for years, leaving congregations isolated without consistent spiritual leadership. Congregations suffered prolonged spiritual deprivation while letters traversed the ocean, and candidates risked shipwreck and disease for ordination. The European judicatory deliberated with a detachment born of geographic distance, transforming a simple matter of church order into a multi-generational crisis of absolute survival. The transatlantic monopoly that ignited the Dutch Reformed Church War. This unstable status quo was thoroughly disrupted by the spiritual currents of the First Great Awakening, a movement that found its primary Dutch expression in this explosive ministry. Arriving in the Raritan Valley of New Jersey, Frelinghuysen introduced an aggressive, pietistic style of ministry that focused heavily on personal conversion and intense internal transformation. The operational methods he deployed, characterized by highly charged emotional sermons and extemporaneous prayers, stood in stark opposition to the formal, intellectualized orthodoxy expected by the distant hierarchy. His rigorous application of church discipline further angered traditionalists, drawing a sharp ideological line between the radical frontier revivalists and the elite authorities of the classis of Amsterdam. The social impact of this ministry was profound. It cultivated a highly participatory, experiential spirituality among the laity, changing how ordinary settlers viewed their role in church. This widespread spiritual awakening in turn generated an unprecedented demand for localized pastoral care and a significantly greater volume of trained ministers to serve the expanding American frontier. By shifting the focus of faith from external adherence to internal conversion, Frelinghuysen's work weakened the psychological and institutional hold of the distant classes of Amsterdam over the people. His ministry served as a vital bridge to the broader American religious landscape, earning the highest commendation of prominent, influential revivalists like the fiery preacher Gilbert Tennant. This powerful network grew as Frelinghuysen collaborated closely with international figures like George Whitefield, uniting diverse colonial congregations under a shared banner of experiential faith. Even the highly intellectual leader Jonathan Edwards praised this localized approach, cementing the movement's status as a transformative force across the entire expanding British colonial world. The immense success of this evangelical approach demonstrated that the spiritual needs of the colonies could no longer be met by the rigid, slow-moving structures of the Old World. Recognizing that the survival of the church depended on a reliable domestic supply of leadership, Frelinghuysen and his allies formulated a dual strategy for institutional reform. The first component involved the creation of a domestic educational institution designed specifically to train young colonial men for the rigorous demands of the gospel ministry. The second component required assembling the scattered churches into an official, localized ecclesiastical body termed a coetus, endowed with the legal authority to perform independent ordinations. In 1737, this formal plan of organization was carefully compiled and dispatched across the Atlantic to the Netherlands for official, binding administrative approval. The reaction from the classis of Amsterdam revealed a deep-seated skepticism regarding the capacity and overall structural maturity of the American frontier churches. The European authorities doubted both the wisdom and practical resources of the colonial congregations, suggesting instead that they merge with neighboring German Reformed or Presbyterian bodies. This dismissive stance produced an agonizing administrative stalemate that lasted for an entire decade, leaving local pulpits completely vacant and congregations deeply frustrated. Only after witnessing other colonial denominations successfully assert their institutional independence and fearing a complete loss of jurisdiction did the classis finally relent. In 1747, Amsterdam granted permission for the coetus, but with severe structural limitations that guaranteed future conflict and set the stage for a deep fracture. The establishment of the coetus in 1747 was not the triumph of self-determination that its proponents had envisioned, but rather an exercise in administrative subordination. The classis of Amsterdam structured this new body with severe legal limitations, ensuring that the reins of ecclesiastical authority remained firmly in European hands. Ostensibly designed to streamline governance, the coetus was denied genuine judicatory power. It functioned merely as an advisory council, with the parent classis reserving final authority. The parent classis explicitly reserved all final legislative and judicial authority to itself, completely neutralizing the domestic leadership and leaving them powerless on the frontier. The operational restrictions placed upon the American Assembly rendered its privileges largely superficial, creating an intense bottleneck over the growing church's most vital survival needs. The most critical bottleneck, the power to examine and ordain candidates for the ministry, was tightly restricted by the distant authorities across the Atlantic. The coetus could not independently elevate qualified young men to the pastorate. Instead, it was required to petition Amsterdam for special permission on a case-by-case basis. Furthermore, any decision made by the local assembly could be easily bypassed through a system of direct, unhindered appeals to the high courts of the Netherlands. This open loophole effectively undermined the domestic body's disciplinary credibility, stripping local leaders of any real respect or enforcement power within their own congregations. This framework created a frustrating paradox. The American church was given an institutional voice, but completely denied the administrative hands required to feed and sustain itself. This unresolved structural dependency left growing congregations trapped in a state of perpetual bureaucratic infancy, pushing the entire colonial denomination toward an explosive breaking point. Beneath the operational frustrations of this system lay a widening ideological chasm regarding the future identity of the church in North America, dividing local communities. The denomination became polarized into two distinct factions, whose deep structural and theological differences extended far beyond mere administrative preferences or simple debates over church order. On one side stood a pro-revival party that drew its inspiration from the legacy of Frelinghuysen, fully embracing the experiential spirituality of the Great Movement. This group embraced the experiential spirituality of the awakening and viewed the unique conditions of the New World as a fertile field for immense spiritual renewal. On the opposing side stood a conservative contingent of ministers and elders who viewed any departure from European standards as a threat to orthodoxy and order. This polarization manifested as a classic conflict between cultural preservation and contextual adaptation, deeply dividing families across the expanding middle colonies over generations. The conservative faction believed that the spiritual integrity of the church was inextricably linked to the preservation of Dutch traditions, liturgical precision, and strict linguistic compliance. Conversely, the pro-revival party recognized that the younger generation of settlers was rapidly assimilating into the broader English-speaking British colonial world around them. The Codas advocates argued that a rigid insistence on Old World customs would alienate the youth and condemn the church to absolute, permanent cultural irrelevance. Consequently, disputes regarding church order and pastoral credentials became the primary battleground for a much deeper, multi-generational debate over the denomination's true purpose. The core issue was whether the denomination would remain an insular European enclave or adapt its educational models to meet the fluid, egalitarian realities of America. For 6 years, the Codas attempted to operate within this restrictive, compromise-ridden framework, but the grim practical realities of the arrangement quickly exposed its total futility. The immense time required to transmit critical correspondence all the way across the Atlantic did not diminish, leaving vital communications completely stalled between the continents. Local frontier congregations grew increasingly impatient and angry with the operational paralysis that constantly defined their ineffective governing body, demanding immediate structural relief from the leadership. The assembly found itself entirely unable to resolve pressing pastoral vacancies, settle intense local congregational disputes, or provide an efficient pathway for young domestic ministerial candidates. Rather than fostering regional stability, the nominal autonomy granted by Amsterdam merely exacerbated deep internal frustrations and significantly deepened the divide between the progressive and conservative factions. By 1754, the progressive leadership within the Coetus definitively concluded that working within this established, slow-moving European system was simply no longer viable for their survival. The severe operational paralysis threatened the very survival of the entire denomination within a rapidly expanding and highly competitive religious marketplace across the American colonies. Recognizing that the parent classes would never voluntarily cede the necessary authority, the brave majority of the Coetus took a definitive, highly radical step forward. In that historic year, the Assembly issued an official, formal declaration of independence, boldly asserting its intention to transform itself into a fully sovereign classis. This historic declaration sought to completely sever the administrative umbilical cord to Holland, firmly claiming the inherent right to educate, examine, and ordain its own ministry. In doing so, the Coetus set aside the compromise framework, a bold move that shattered the fragile peace and plunged the church into a bitter schism. In that year, the Assembly issued a formal declaration of independence, asserting its intention to transform itself from a mere advisory body into a fully independent sovereign classis. This historic declaration sought to sever the administrative umbilical cord to Holland, claiming the inherent right to educate, examine, and ordain its own ministry. In doing so, the Codice set aside the compromised framework of 1747, a bold move that shattered the fragile peace of the denomination and caused an open schism. The line in the sand had been drawn. The progressives had made their move, but the traditionalists were not about to surrender the soul of the church without a fight. What happens when an institutional rebellion triggers an immediate, aggressive counterstrike from within your own pews, tearing your closest community apart? How did a fight over paperwork turn into a multi-decade war that split families, locked sanctuaries, and tore communities apart across the colonies? Find out in part 2 of the Church War that split early America, where we witness the explosive rise of the conservative Conférencier faction. We will follow the years of open warfare in the congregations and the arrival of the brilliant young diplomat who would risk everything to piece things back together. Make sure you are subscribed to Theology Today right here so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion tomorrow. See you then.